Hi, good morning, everyone. We know it's not a good morning. Yeah, my God. In 17 years, I never encountered weather like this for our conference. And the last time I was in Vienna, it was beautiful, the weather, same time of the year. But never mind, we're on to the final day. And we have very eminent plenary speakers this morning. The first of whom is Charles Landry. And he's the founder of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival in Berlin, which he's just come from there. And it's an amazing phenomenon. He speaks he's both German and English, so it's bilingual, the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. And Charles is also engages, with creative bureaucracy and civil society in a nomadic world. And his bio is amazing, that you'll find. Yeah, here comes Charles. Welcome, in place. Charles, welcome. I first met Charles in 1992. I was the chair of the Joint Heritage Committee for the Federal Capital of Australia. And Charles came to Canberra so that we could re-envision a capital that was completely planned, bureaucratic, and how to make it more alive. He had a huge impact on the National Capital Planning Authority at that stage. Also, I remember his bio doesn't mention these things because it'll go into a book if we do that. The other thing I remember is some of you might remember Barcelona Olympics. And Charles is the one who is responsible for the cultural planning of the city of Barcelona with the upcoming Olympics. And that has transformed Barcelona completely. And I remember going to Forum Barcelona in 2004, and the transformation was acclaimed as one of the best in the world. And lastly, there is what is called Creative Cities Network of UNESCO, and there's a European network. I think the last time I attended that was in Bilbao, and it's based on Charles's creative idea of a city being creative for change, and he, in one sense, sort of highlights the existential crisis that we all face. We're all migrants in a nomadic world, and yet we're trying to explore our sense of place and identity, in the cities, mostly in the cities. So what does it mean? Where do we belong? And what does inclusion mean? And I think that please read his bio on the web that you all have. And his latest book is, I have a copy of it. I was reading it last night, so I slept about 12:30. And once you pick it up, you can't put it down because Charles is so eloquent in the way he writes. All right, Charles, over to you. Welcome, Charles, please.
Well, as you know, Amar is prone to exaggeration. So that's just one point. But a quick shout out, really. I was in your event in Delhi in 2013, and when you talked about these things a long time ago, inclusion, what the hell do you bloody mean inclusion? And now it is very normalized. But also, I do want to say to Tamsin and Philip, that common ground thing is an amazing business model. Is Tamsin here? Is Philip here? No. But anyway, I just think it's amazing the way that has all been put together. So I'm going to do a sort of bit of going here, there. It's Sunday morning and all of that. You know what I mean? But what I found so interesting, when I saw the one paragraph, I sort of thought, hey, the word that interests me most is inter, the inter bit. because we, for many, many years, were doing stuff like the intercultural city. How do you, we did sort of 6, 7 books, and we did studies over Australia, New Zealand, Norway, England, and so on. And it was basically about how do you see the world through the others, and how do you connect with the others in different ways. And it's called How You Can Plan Through a Diversity Advantage. So inter really, I really like. But then when it gets to intersectionality, it's sort of really a tongue twister. Now, I do know that it comes from the feminist movement. And what was great about being invited to this event is that I had the opportunity to read Bell Hooks, and talking about clear writing. It's fantastically clear writing, and I know what people want to say, intersectionality, because it sounds abstract and you can build a theory and all of that. I understand all that, but I think communication is absolutely vital, and so therefore I prefer the phrase interconnections or things like that, or seeing things from a 360-degree way. And I think I've experienced it myself. It's such a drag that you see things through a sort of limited spectrum. And that's been my main struggle in my life, to try to break that down in one sort of way. And last week, I was in Christiansand, which is a new museum in this silo. There are not that many museums in silos, and I thought I'd show you that, because for 40 years we've been saying, let's break down silos, and here is a museum in a silo, and it's okay, and it's quite impressive, and whatever. Anyway, so I think the epochal challenge is, how do we know things, and what should we really know? And it was quite interesting. There was a sign in the museum at Bedford yesterday which said, what did it say? It said something, should museums leave something hidden? Should we keep some secrets? The answer, obviously, they were saying is no. But what I've really been struggling through my life, not necessarily successfully, is to try to blend forms of knowing, and actually even in my mind to do that. And I'm going to tell you something in a minute, which is a personal story. I don't mind telling you my personal stories, which really I had a massive crisis on that point of, these separations. And I'll come back to that in a second. So really the guiding principles that I'm going to highlight throughout what I'm saying is obviously this 360-degree immersive perspective, this interdisciplinary perspective, where you don't have to know everything. You might know something. I'm not against the discipline. But what I think we do need to know is the essence of what other disciplines are. And one of the major weaknesses of the cultural world is lack of knowledge about finance and money and how it works and so on. And that, I think, is the big challenge, because there are so many ways of rethinking finance. And I'm not saying you're illiterate, but so many people are completely illiterate in terms of thinking about money and how money works and so on. So knowing the essence of that, but knowing if I'm anthropologist, I should know the essence of, social affairs or something. You get the idea of what I'm talking about. So anyway, so what I've been thinking about, and I think what I've heard a bit here, is a lot of what you've been talking about, making sense, that creates understanding. But what more importantly, I think what a lot of you have been talking about is making meaning, or meaning making, which creates significance. Because I'm always thinking, the title of what I'm talking about is what triggers change. And what really triggers change is when something feels significant. And you may then, through that emotional drive, actually act. Now, what that's led me to do is think of 3 things. One, the rational. I vaguely know what the rational is. I hope I do at least vaguely, logic and so on. But what I'm really interested in, and I think we've seen quite a bit of it in the last few days, perhaps the rain is irrational, I don't know, but is the irrational, which of course is different from the irrational. And I think so much of what gets us to this different register of experience, because when I said meaning making is about significance, is often that is beyond the rational, that gets into some different register in people's minds, at least it did in mine. And so obviously it's about knowing yourself and self-reflection. We heard a lot about that yesterday. but viscerally feeling, perceiving, because the primary thing is perception. And I wrote a book called The Sensory Landscape of City, which is from everything you touch and feel and see and so on. How is that perceived? What does it mean? Because, for example, cities communicate through every fiber of their being, whether it's physical, intangible, and so on. And then obviously experiencing through the eyes of others. And that was so great reading Bell Hooks just on that, because obviously I'm not black, I'm not a woman, bloody, 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 blah. But I am an immigrant, by the way. My name is Landry, but it's a fake, because my grandfather was an opera singer, and he was called Schmidt. And anyone who knows Schmidt, it's the most common name. So he said, warum nehme ich nicht Landry? So he took Landry. So I seem, like a sort of British guy, but I'm not at all. But what it meant, they were speaking in England with these German accents. And at the time, I mean, it's not the same as being black, but it's relatively negative. Anyway, so what I'm really saying is this also, reminds us of the distorted views, and that one needs to look at things from the wider lens. So I just wanted to say something about what changed my mind. When I was about 23, my father was a philosopher and my mother, they were heavily intellectual, so bloody intellectual. Anyway, so in that intellectualism, I had to study ancient Greek, 9 years of Latin, all of that. So I was embedded in the European way of thinking, but I felt so incredibly trapped that there must be another way, which ultimately got me into the irrational and so on. And I was on this train, and I remember it even today, and I'm sorry because it was so powerful. The 6:53 train gliding out of Ulm on its way to Munich. The sun is screeching into my eyes. There seems to be something happening to me. All the barriers seem to be breaking down. Indeed, they did. Between that Western way of ding-dong, left, right, up, down, sideways thinking, that my mind exploded, and I got into this realm, which was a combination of fear and bliss. And it took me several years to recover from that. But what it did do is it completely shaped my sense of myself. Even today, I wish I could have the bliss feeling rather than the fear feeling, in terms of what you'll see in how I talk. Now, also, of course, museums have changed my mind. And there have been many, and I'm just going to mention a couple of things from recently. So that's the thing about, getting beyond the either or ding dong. And just to, Amar will know this. This is Adelaide. And what I like about this in terms of ding dong thinking is you've got that linearity of Western thinking and that Aboriginal, let's call it aesthetic or something. Now, the only thing I'm not telling you is these bloody idiots. Do you know what they put in the middle of that? A subway. I hadn't shown you the picture with the subway because that came 3 years later, because I just want the purity of the core idea of these different ways of thinking, blending and seeing it in the physical. Another thing, a thing that did change my mind was Banksy's exhibition at the Social History Museum in Bristol, where 270,000 people came to this museum, to this show. Social history museums, as you know, normally 4 people and a dog every day and some school children. I'm exaggerating. But anyway, he subverted this museum, and Bristol's population is only 250,000. And the reason was because he subverted about 80 little elements, and each of them told a story. And for me, it links ultimately to the SDGs. This, of course, is giving nature a voice. Let's look at it from the other perspective. Another that really affected me deeply was the District 6 Museum in Cape Town at the time. The reconstruction of the streets where people lived and were, pushed out to Langa, which was 14k away. But what was so beautiful about this was that you could be a maker shaper. Well, not me, because I didn't live there, but the person who lived there could shape the story as it unfolded by being part of placing their name in where it was. And just a last example, this is just only a way to liven us all up in the morning. I was yesterday or the day before in Budapest because I was in Veszprém, which is a small place. And hey, this is the wrong way around, this photo. Anyway, you get the idea. What there is, it's the Museum of Terror. And all of these faces of people, of course, were killed through the Arrow Cross, you know, the fascists and then the communists. And this was the building where they were killed and tortured and mutilated. So because this was 2 days ago, it certainly affected me as I came onto the train towards rainy Vienna. Anyway, so in terms of then just coming into where we want to go, the future is really about some forms of alignment. In a sense, what I just said, aligning forms of knowledge, not having these separations, and finding ways of orchestrating these. This is Jim Landry, a picture, anyway, it doesn't matter, it's an artist. And a way of orchestrating and aligning it, that it goes in some sort of direction, ideally positive. And so what this really led me to believe, all this thing about alignment and so on, is what was it like then and what is it like now? We said about then inclusivity wasn't very popular when Amar started that. But what was then was one thing. But what is now is that the earth hurts. It's not, can't be a coincidence, this dramatic weather change in the last few days here in Vienna. And that's what led me, and this is the cover of this Civic City in a Nomadic World, is it led me to think, how can you heal the crack that we are all part of? And it's easy for me just to sort of talk to you, I hope not at you, to talk to you about that crack. But I feel that is one of the things we need to do, because we know the urgency. I calculated the days till 1st of January 2030, which everybody talks about, seems to be going down the days, they're not going up, and ditto to 250. And these days, they're not that many days. And I think what we all know is that we're in the midst of a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach will not get us to where we need to be. We're in a world where the economic order and way of life is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. And so that raises an issue. So what is this massive issue that this raises? It raises the issue that, as far as I'm concerned, because we're in a culture vulture session here, and this is where we all are, is that the biggest cultural project of our times is the transition that we are trying to cope with, embedded or embodied in, I suppose, the SDGs, if you want to put it like that. And to some extent, seeing this as a cultural project, to me personally, is at least liberating and was an insight, rather than seeing it as a set of fragments of initiatives. You know, you've got to deal with poverty, inequality, water, and so on. And one of the things about that is that also making worlds, I might have said making a place or making a city, is a cultural project. And we know why, of course, because it's about values, habits, mindsets, aesthetics. I don't mean aesthetics in terms of beautiful, how we perceive things, behaviors, and so on. And so the result of these values, of course, etches itself into all our mental modes, patterns, the way things look, feel, and so on. And it establishes how organizations think, plan, act. And furthermore, I did another little book, these little books. I always ask someone to collaborate with me, just write a little book, and then it's out of your head, and then you go on to something, the next thing, which is called Psychology in the City, the Hidden Dimension, because I think this is a psychological problem that we need to psychologically deal with and adapt to. Now, I'm not saying, that was Freud's couch, by the way, that we all need to go to the psychotherapist, but I do believe that we need to acknowledge that this is a major psychological issue for all of us. Now, what I'm about to say is so obvious, but I'm just trying to simplify my life and life, is what are our resources? In essence, what I've just said is culture is who we are, and therefore what we can become. And creativity helps what we can become, which is why the link for me between culture and creativity is absolutely essential. If I was talking about cities, I'd say the link between that and city making is also key, but we're talking about a bigger world here. But of course, culture is not the operating system. Far too often still, you know, people are sort of demanding, I mean, Caroline was having to justify, you have to advocate, you have to do all this stuff at UNESCO. And so many people still don't believe necessarily what you say. Whereas if someone asks me now to do a project about what is the value of culture, I say, no, 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 no. I'm not doing any more projects about maths and, you know, numbers about the value of culture. I only ever say to the person who's asking me and puts me on the defensive, I have to justify myself to say, what is the cost of you not valuing culture? And if you do that switch, what you suddenly find, that person either shrivels or has enlightenment, or anyway, they don't sort of bang on at you to give the value of culture. Because of course, cultural insight, as far as I'm concerned, is the really invisible hand. I wrote a book with Jeff Malden called The Other Invisible Hand, which is about the invisible hand of sociality, though I'm not going to use a word with ality at the end, socialness and so on, in it. And because, you know, capitalism in Japan, Sweden, the US and Germany is different. It's cultural reasons why it's different. And of course, culture is to do with identity, as we know. But what this really means, and I'm thinking about us as a community of culture people, is what it means, some very big questions, which are quite difficult, and it's also a question to museums, is how can we unlearn the worst of capitalism? We constantly talk about learning lessons, but how do we unlearn in a way that we viscerally feel what that unlearning actually means? And then recognizing, which I think we here in this room probably do, is that the market on its own cannot solve the interconnected challenges that the inclusive museum theme has posed to us with SDGs and so on. And indeed, you need to find ways of bending the market to bigger picture purposes, by which I mean, you know, ethics and so on. And what that means is, and this is back to this thing about understanding finance, there are so many financial vehicles that exist that do deal with money in a different way. There are resilience bonds, green bonds, lots of them, which are not profit maximizing. They're finding ways of looking at longer term, other forms of value creation beyond the narrow financial one. So all I'm saying, these are very big questions which I believe we should try and answer. And of course, this requires some courage and determination, because of course, the moment you raise these questions, some finance person who claims, you know, bugger all about finance will try and give you a hard time, say you're naive, and all of this sort of stuff. You know all of that. Now, do the SDGs address any of this thing in an interconnected way, as distinct from the 17 very important things that they highlight? Because, of course, they're entangled. They're entangled. One links to the other. You know, how can you talk about, I mean, women's rights, poverty, inequality? I'm just thinking, I can't have them all in my mind. I bet you, Caroline, have the 17 like that. Dum, 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 dum. It's a great song. I'm going to test you later. Anyway, I've just mentioned a few, but we know, given these entanglements, that so many things are getting worse. They're getting down. Levels of inequality, the numbers seem to be going up, as an example. The levels of people, a few people being richer, is also going up, the billionaires. We also know that the climate emissions type stuff is going up and up and up. All of that you know, so there's nothing for me to say. And that raises an interesting question. And again, I know it's so easy to say this, difficult to do, which is, what is this has decided to stick, because I'm probably moving too fast. It doesn't like it, all right? You see? Oh, what shall I do? Shall I just give up?
Don't give up. Maybe let's just.
Look, she got. Tamsin's got fingers.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine. I was.
my computer, so I know how to do it.
Yeah, but I mean, actually, things have a level of sensitivity that mine don't.
They are freakishly long.
They are freakishly long and freakishly wonderful. Anyway, this led me to think through and try and imagine what is the relevance of resistance. And many of you will know Berlin, and they opened a large development area called Holzmark, which is completely alternative, and it's on the river, some skyscrapers. And I was asked to do the opening talk 10 years ago, and it was called The Relevance of Resistance. And I then said, okay, if this is 100 and this is 0, the relevance is here. Then last year, it was 10 years later, amongst others, I had to do a 5-minute pitch, and I said, oh, where does my relevance of resistance point stand? And I suddenly realized it was there. So something's happened in the last 10 years, as far as I'm concerned, that obviously things are worse. And you could say, as it says here in this graffiti, it's 1 minute towards midnight. But what we do know is the fragility is ever present. So the question, the relevance of resistance, I mean, some people say no, some people say yes, and some people say probably maybe. This is just an artist who's in a flat of ours where I live in Stroud. This is in Stroud. He does this every 3 weeks, a new word. Anyway, so yes, no, maybe, I don't know. We could do a survey later. But one thing we do know is that we all need to wake up because the issues we've just been discussing are affecting us now. And one of the interesting things this guy, Andrew Wood, did is when there was the lockdown, he said one of his words was lockdown. I thought that was brilliant. Lockdown. Yeah, luck was down. But then I thought, shit, hey, the clouds, it's cloudy, 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 cloudy. Let me wait for the sun. Lockdown. Because the birds began to sing, the air was cleaner. But then people said, let's go back to that past, which feels like an exotic destination, that past where the fumes were in our nostrils and all of that. So there is a real issue. So I did the same with oxygen when he put oxygen up. I said, no, I want the bright oxygen picture. So anyway, the point is, what's interesting about this for me is this is communicating to a city. You would call it a public artwork. It's been going for 7 years. And it's really a different form of communication. But what it's all about, of course, is ultimately about reducing our carbon footprint and thinking of alternatives and imagining alternatives. And what I like about the best museum shows and museums, of course, is their capacity to imagine with us, for us, those alternatives that could be. And where I find artists or artistically thinking people, because I think also, you know, it's not only the artists who are creative, there are a lot of people here, perhaps social entrepreneurs in this room, interesting academics who are creative. So I'm really against only having that category, but they do have a certain understanding. And at the recent Ocean Marine Conference in London, I thought that was brilliant. I mean, just talking about the pain of the fish. And this is back to how do you viscerally feel something that could ideally, not, I hope it doesn't frighten us, but actually causes us to act. And perhaps more calm is obviously Olafur Eliasson's ice thing, melting ice, which was in Paris, for example, and so on, which meant that ice does melt. But there's one issue, which Arts Electronica in Linz, you know, which is a museum, but a modern type of museum, you could call it. It is a, whatever, a multimedia museum, which had this work, because one of the things, when I was born, there were 2.1 billion people in the world. Now there's nearly 8 billion. Now, of course, you're going to have more pandemics, isn't it? You're going to have to lift up the soil, all that stuff that's deeply hidden in there, you know. So, of course, this pressure of too many people is causing all sorts of things. I mean, the fantasy, oh, cities are great. Yeah, they are great, but they're growing, they're growing, they're growing. We're not addressing a wonderfully difficult dilemma of how do you grow and become economically sustainable when there are proportionately less than people. Very interesting dilemma. Or another thing that I think was a beautiful thing, and you could call this a museum, it was at the Dubai Expo, World Expo, which was in the sustainability area. And this is an immersive experience. The whole building was the river, because the river was given a personality and a legal right in New Zealand law. So you then, by being the river, you are the river, you feel differently than just sort of reading a text and saying, oh, rivers are very important. It's just as a completely different sort of experience. Now, a lot of this is to do with something. I was in Lviv a long time ago, when I say a long time ago, just before the crisis. And they said, my argument here is you can invent anything, is what I'm really saying. Yeah? There were lots of corruption, as you know. I know we're for Ukraine, but you know, it has been incredibly corrupt. But the people I was working with were incorruptible. They were business people, very wonderful. And I said to them, hey, we have biennales of art. Why don't you have a biennale of trust? And they said, shit. I said, go and get that thing, biennaleoftrust.com, and they got it. And we had this Biennale of Trust that did a variety of things. So again, these are the sort of issues. Now, this trust thing is so flexible in a sense that it could be connecting to other SDG things. But just as a reminder, I think looking at the city as well, and I know you might think I'm jumping around, it is quite important. I saw this near Ghent, and it said, capitalism is chaos, okay? Anarchy is order. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The main point is, well, what is the bloody main point? The main point is it makes you think. And so, you know, there are so many ways of doing this, like this is in Penang in Malaysia, or again, where a record shop is trying to foster intercultural understanding. So you can do things, the messaging, this is why I'm coming back to how we communicate. Now, there was also an interesting event I was in Toronto. Again, it's a performance. It's a performance in a space that is a cultural space. And I'm one of these people who's in a box. And I find it very uncomfortable being in a box, let's say talking to Elisa, which would be a dreadful thing to do, and then therefore not have proper understanding. And this went on, which was all about this thing that you need to, in a sense, harmonize. Now, again, you might think, hey, guys, you're being trivial. Obviously, there's more behind this. There's more explanations. There's, you know, I'm just giving snapshots. But you can, again, back to public space. In Zurich West, which is, you know, the hip area of Zurich, you know, where all the apparently hip places, Amazon or eBay, are up there, they build a Renaissance hotel. They knock everything down and build a Renaissance hotel. One artist says, you're not knocking down my house, and puts the word resistance in the same typeface. So urban development, I know we're talking about cities now, that is the dilemma of dilemmas. How do you maintain affordable housing? How do you, when areas become poshed out, how do you do that? But isn't that fantastic? So it just like that. So that's what I would call iconic communication. And iconic communication, as distinct from narrative communications, and academics and so on, and you're all wonderful, tend to be more narrative. Iconic communications, you understand it in one and then unscramble it later. Narrative communication has a wider bandwidth, and you have to go step by step, and my argument is, and my hypothesis is, and I've concluded that. You get the idea. So playing with this, I think, is really important. Now, we all know that everything that I'm now discussing actually is a much bigger issue and can't be just dealt with in a project itself. And it's true that there are so many people out there who really remind us that another world is possible. And here is another one of these biennales, the Biennale Democrazia. And I think that idea should spread even more, given the threats to the democracy and so on. And it was interesting that Amar mentioned Canberra, because there was a really interesting show, and this is what I'm feeling, that is a switch. I think certainly, I mean, we're all amongst ourselves, but I think more people feel that one needs to think beyond the self. And of course, I'm as egotistical as, of course, I'm egotistical in many ways. I hope I'm occasionally not egotistical, but you know what I'm trying to say, that I can somehow think beyond my self-interest. And it was interesting in Copenhagen, on the floor of the Architectural Museum, it said something again, which I reused in the art of city making, this phrase, be best not in, but for the world. So I would say, don't be the most creative or try to be the most creative city in the world, but try to be the most creative city for the world. That one change in word is just quite dramatic. Now, basically, I think there's a yearning for all of this. However, I think it hits a brick wall. And what is that brick wall? Now, through the pandemic, I read so much and I thought, oh my God. So many people are talking about change and systemic change. Well, if I hear that word again, change, systemic change. And I kept on thinking, hey, guys, so there's no really deep change. Obviously, some things are changing. Inclusion is more on the agenda. But in terms of the real structural manifestations and dynamics, it isn't there, which is back to my difficult questions about unlearning the worst of capitalism. So I feel one needs to call out and name those who are causing us a problem. Because when I see these goals, and Caroline, please say them all off by heart, you know, when I see them, they are so incredibly important. Every one of them. I'm just looking at quality education. And what else am I saying? My God, it doesn't matter what I'm seeing. But what I'm seeing looks unbelievably important. And now the question to me is, can you deal with the SDGs in a fragmented way? Of course, there will be water projects. Of course, there will be some of your diversity projects. Of course, all of that is incredibly vital. But I don't know why I'm repeating that phrase. There we are. So the obstacles, what are they? The obstacles, as we know, are vested interests. Those are real vested interests. They have a vested interest. Entrenched, that's people who can't really think beyond where they're at, which is slightly different. Bad ideas. Now, one of the big obstacles is bad ideas. Now, the beauty of bad ideas, it's only 7 letters. If I'd said the complexity of the notion of ideas, it's different than if you say to someone, bad ideas. A bad idea is, for example, that the market can solve all our problems. Is that a bad idea? So we need to say, that's a, sorry, I'm being a bit stupid, but you get the idea. So the other one is acceleration and speed. Now, you're all digital natives, and I've worked out, even bloody hell, I look at my phone more than I want to, and I'm an old guy. It's absolute shit. So that's a problem. It's an obstacle because it means the lack of self-reflection, and therefore that sense of things that are out of control. So acceleration, we'll see this young woman later, she's from Seoul, and what she is about. So therefore, that's a bad idea, obviously, the acceleration. Polarization. It's impossible to have a single communication channel. I don't need to talk about fake news, we know all of that. There's no shared information space anymore. All of these things, and I'm not saying historically in the UK, the BBC was regarded as relatively objective. I'm not saying it's wonderful, but nevertheless, all of these things are dramatically challenged. So there's nothing shared. And then the anxiety. I'm doing a project with people who are around 27, and I'm sort of, they've got to be over 70. There's got to be a pair. I'm over 70. They've got to be around 30. And we've got to mutually learn. I've got to learn about my anxiety, the anxiety towards death, their anxiety towards climate issues and so on. And these are obstacles. So somehow intergenerationally dealing, for example, with that is important. So a lot of that, of course, is about coming together. We've done enough of this sort of stuff. The obstacles here that I'm putting up are just basically ones about the thinking that we went through, ding dong thinking, either or, and so on. Not getting to the essence of the problem, again, easy for me to say and difficult to do. But one of the things that I think is really important is endless forgetting of what worked. So there's partly this problem about critical thinking. This is at Arts Electronica, an exhibition, and the endless forgetting. We have these things, good ideas. There are lots of ways, if you talked about cities, we know there are certain principles about great city making, but we forget them because we let the property development logic run riot over how place and space work. So memory, all of these things, the good things about the memory institutions, and I know museums are not only about memory, are absolutely vital. So we do need a plan B, and I think the plan B is embodied in your themes and what you're trying to do here. So what drives change? I think we know what drives change. What I'm saying is obvious. We need to reframe. And what is reframing? Reframing is the art of thinking differently. But back to my first point, how do you viscerally feel that different thinking? This is one thing just saying I'm thinking differently. It's to feel it viscerally. And so, for example, what triggers change? Many of these things were mentioned yesterday. Worldviews was mentioned yesterday, and ethics, principles and priorities. All of that we know from policy making, criteria and missions. I was listening to your education thing. A lot of these sort of things which are very important were mentioned there. And of course, then disposition. But dispositions is a sort of vaguely slippery beast, because a disposition often is shaped by the cultural environment we're in. And let's say there are 20% of horrible people and 20% of nice people, whatever the difference is, but 60% of people, you could go either way. I think the culture of the place shifts the disposition either to the negative or more to the positive. So now what? Now, I think one does need to look at it through the eyes of the young. And so I was standing in front of a lift and it said, "Can you open these doors for me?" And so I just took the photo and then the door opened. And in a sense, this is just a metaphor. It's precisely these, because I've been trying to really communicate with as many people who are so much younger than me. And I'm really seeing a completely different perceptions for myself and for my life. And so I'm asking myself, what can I bring, or what can we bring together to this change-making thing? And that's why I'm getting back to and in this case, intergenerational thinking. And what this is all about, of course, means that we need to see, feel the city or feel the world. And someone said yesterday about the senses, and I think I mentioned that I wrote something about a book called The Sensory Perspective, which is really interesting. I put this in because it's India and Amar's from India. I know this is Jodhpur, doesn't matter, but it's blue. And one thing about it all being blue, it's very blue. It's really blue. And Marrakesh is quite pink and Berlin is quite gray. I'm just saying these things, sorry, that's to some extent trivial, but what it is, it's about this sensory stuff. And when we look at places, worlds, we know, of course, it's about the people. We know it's about all the range of activities and the economics and social. We know it's about the hardware and software of all these things that make urban and rural worlds work. We know it's about software, the invisible things that do a click here and a click there. We know it's about how things are managed and organized. And that's the thing. I mean, I felt that at the Belgium Museum yesterday, the curator was trying, I felt he really wanted to open things out, didn't he? I mean, him and his friend there were really great. And of course, it's about how these elements in places connect and how they then form some sort of mosaic. But where I think it's so difficult, which is back to that word orchestration and alignment I used at the top, is how is this calibrated? Are there enough settings, for example, in museums, where these partners, the public, the private, the not-for-profit, academia, come together as equal partners in exploring something that could be vital for whatever they want to project and promote. And that sort of thing, I think, would bring many of our institutions to life, because we're back to these sectors that only see fragments. Seeing our differences with mutual respect is key. And I believe that could create a different sort of story that may, and of course ideally should, speak to all of us. And so it would accelerate back to this young girl, that could accelerate the sort of change we're talking about. Because great change making, and I could have said great city making, change making doesn't really matter. And I love this. It took me 35 years to work out the sentence. Is more like improvised jazz than a well-tempered symphony performance. Because all the things that I'm saying are, you've got to be flexible. It's a bit like Tai Chi. You've got to have ethical principles. You've got to be, you know what I mean? You've got to be lots of things. But can you see what I'm trying to say? So my approach and my guiding principles on this improvised jazz idea is, if I'm working in a cultural context, is to make the distinction between cultural planning and planning culturally. And I know in German it doesn't work that well, Kulturplanung, planning with eine kulturelle Perspektive and so on, is different. But in English it really works, because planning culturally means understanding culture as who we are, what we were, where we come from, where we might go, and affects beautifully could not only be about what are the institutions I'm going to build, what is the art centre, what is the arts project, and so on. And it's a dramatic worldview because it normalizes the cultural perspectives. And on rethinking planning, let's rethink planning culturally. If you go through the essence of have cultural literacy of your place, you're going like this. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were saying shut up. Don't worry. No. But is rethinking planning from a cultural perspective for health services or the economy, all of these things, this is just a list. But the point is, what I've found really interesting, when that's normalized, you suddenly see these institutions opening out, which makes partnerships more possible with other types of folks. And I don't think this is a simple instrumentalizing. So what this is all about, and I suppose the creative city idea is about that in one sentence, 400 pages of book in one sentence, how to create the conditions for people to think, plan, and act with imagination to solve problems and create opportunities. So I'm going to speed up. I'm nearly finished, don't worry. So what that means is, how do you move in planning from a predict and provide model to what I would call elastic planning, which is strategically principled and tactically flexible. You know where you're going, you know what you want, but you know it takes a long time. You know you can't have the 5-year plan. And what this is then about is this continual interplay between the intrinsic value of culture and arts, the instrumental value, and the institutional value. And it's that interplay between the institutions, of course, incredibly important for all sorts of reasons we don't need to go into. And what that means, that interplay is between a wide sense of culture that I've talked about and the narrow ones. And of course, the cultural institutions are key in that. Now, what I found also is going with the grain of culture, the cultural perspective, makes people, in my experience, maybe not be in yours, be more willing to change than if you went through the opposite and neglected their culture. They're willing to move with you in a dynamic. And what that then obviously is about is understanding their resources, auditing what's, the soft stuff, the intangible, the hard stuff, and so on. All of the things that are incredibly familiar to you. And in terms of SDGs, I have to say that 17 times 17, where are the 17 times 17 people? They're probably not in this room. But whoever had that idea, it was a very good idea. I feel it's a brilliant idea. It's so clearly stated. I understand it. Now, the question is, who else and what are they doing? Because I then looked up who else is doing what. And I didn't see enough of 17 times 17 type projects. So what we're trying to do here is obviously, create alternatives, foster experiments and R&D, and leave room for the unexpected. And a few more points. What this is all about, because things are pretty negative, is I think we should take the glass half full approach rather than empty, because we're going to be drained by the realities of people saying no, no, no all the time. So you might as well start with a glass half full approach, look at weakness and try and turn them into strengths. And then ask yourself the question, is this place, this project we're doing, a place of projects? Is it just the Vent project and the Mac project and all of that? Or is this the project, the whole place? Again, very simple to say, very different. The whole place is the project. The whole SDGs is the project, not the 17 elements. Which brings me to my final point, and Amar knows this, that I'm obsessed. Whoever's the first person, there's one copy of the Creative Bureaucracy book there, whoever first can get it, others can take the others, is the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, where we run a festival in Berlin. And 1,700 people came in June from 40 countries. Why? Why? Because there is a deep desire to do things differently. And our German friends will know what this means is Dienstweg, official route, no way. Dienstweg, kein Durchgang. Doesn't it sound beautiful? Shall I say it slowly? Dienstweg, kein Durchgang. But there is a Durchgang, because what our whole event is about, our festival and the idea, is reframing so that the vision shapes the rules, not the rules, the vision. Easy to say, difficult to do. And rethinking the incentives and regulations regime. And moving from a disposition that says, moving from a no because to a yes if culture, because we want the inspiration, for example, of young people who might say, does this work? Is this tried and tested? No, because, no. Yes, that's interesting. If. Very different. This is a Russian artwork here, but it expresses this thing of reshifting the rules. So this festival does all sorts of stuff like that. And I think it's a movement in the making. And what it helps is something that I think is implied in everything you've said, which is the dialogue of difference, which is my thing, again, about intercultural, and also then finally blending the great ways of knowing, exploring, playing, discovering insight, all of that. That blending together, I think, is fabulous. And I'm only showing you this as I finish, because that was an exhibition I did, and I think it's quite nice, this old little stupid vehicle running around. Thank you very much. Sorry, that took a bit longer. I don't even start because I'm in some sort of flow.
Perfect, Charles. Thank you so much. I think there are two things that while people think about questions, sometimes you will take the mic around. I want to mention that you reminded, one is the 17 SDGs, what is it that holds them together? So when the MDGs were being reviewed in Rio de Janeiro, was with the International Local Government Association, we advocated for culture as a goal, as a MDG, for the future Millennium Development Goals from 2015. There's very strong support. But then before they were adopted, SDGs were adopted, it went to the World Bank for comment. It's the World Bank economists, the economic fundamentalists, as I call them, who actually determine the measures. When they were determining the measures, they said, no, we can't measure culture. There's so much literature, David Crosby and others, leading thinkers. And the second thing I just want to mention is, by the way, Mondial convened the conference 2022 by UNESCO. And again, next year in Barcelona wants culture to be a separate SDG. And we advocated that in 2012, leading to 2015, it didn't work. Let's see if it works after 2030. The other thing is that you showed the map of District 6 Museum. I was actually the facilitator for the establishment of the museum.
how it came about is very creative. You know, resonates with a lot of the things that you said, Charles. We were having a land, I worked for 5 years in South Africa during the term of Mandela. And District 6, 80,000 people were removed, their houses were bulldozed. In 1964, when they all got a love letter saying that this area is only for white people. So all the colored people who lived there had to be removed. But the guy who ran the bulldozers, he walked through one of our meetings, started grunting. We thought somebody was shot dead outside. When we went outside, he had all the street signs, all the street signs. On the back of his truck, he wanted us to take him. And so that's how the first exhibition started, called Streets Exhibition. And the map was drawn by Peggy Oliver, who was a local artist. But then it was meant to be only for 2 weeks. But people kept coming in. And then we had 17 trustees, including an anarchist, Dr. Combrec, who didn't want any money from the government. So it's entirely run through non-government resources. It still continues. It's almost become for museum people an iconic destination, and for human rights an iconic destination. But thanks for bringing that back. It sums up that creative thinking that you advocate so strongly. Question.
We're running low on time, so we probably have time for just one question, and we can continue the conversation afterwards. Sorry. Does anyone have a question? Okay, I'll jump over there.
Rudy. Rudy is from the Theatre Museum, guaranteeing the Vienna, please.
Thank you so much. Rudy Risati from the Theatre Museum here in Vienna. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Indeed, nowadays I feel we live in a period of sectionality, separation and segregation, where apparently the word inter is really missing. And sometimes, if seeing all the situation we are living, the present times we are living in, I come to a saying that in German is coming to my mind, that we say here in Vienna very often: the Decke ist zu kurz. The blanket seems to be too short. I'm not sure whether this is true. This is really true, because there might be also on the economical level maybe some solution to explain and to show that the Decke is not really zu kurz, it's not too short, because there might be other solutions for many problems in the world. However, this fear or the feeling something is missing, we are too many, the blanket is too short, leads to a very irrational movement around the society, in society, etc. So you were talking about the importance of seeing the glass half full. How can we foster this feeling, and how can we do it? How can we achieve this positive sensation on a personal level, in the society, in culture, etc.?
No, that's a great question, and I'm glad you raised it, because what I could have said and should have said, if you take a helicopter view of things, practically every problem that we're talking about has been solved somewhere. The only problem is it's an isolated speck in the landscape. And if one could bring people together in a different way, then which then combines the energies. And that's the problem, because our models of thinking about how you bring people together, either through class or these other left-right things, are breaking down, which makes it very, very, very difficult. So I don't think I'm actually giving the answer. I mean, the glass half full for me is the fact that these solutions exist. My question to myself, which I find difficult to answer, is how these fragments come together. How can you bring these fragments into a powerful movement? All I can say, and this is not really a good answer, on the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, the aim of that is how do you run things differently is the aim of the event. And what people say, and this is only a beginning, it's not the full answer, is saying we are not alone. And that feeling of we are not alone because they are together in that place has had some power, but not enough power to answer the full question that you're raising. So if I knew that answer really very clearly, I'd be, I don't know what. Anyway,